we're so concerned about other things, heart disease, and we take care of so many other issues we prevent, but nobody really thinks about their bones until they're older and they either get a diagnosis of osteoporosis or osteopenia, or they fall and have a fracture and break a bone. And the problem is it's really common. In the United States, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 will have a fracture due to osteoporosis in their lifetime. So that's huge. In other countries, it's better worldwide. It's 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, but still, that's a huge number. So it's very prevalent. And the problem is the consequences of these fractures are devastating. So if someone has a hip fracture, 24%, actually it's even over that now, will die within a year after that hip fracture due to complications. And then a huge percent will also either they're just never going to be independent, or completely destroys, really changes the quality of your life. So the good news is that there's so much that can be done to prevent this. So nobody has to be one of these statistics. And it starts in childhood. I mean, it really starts. We have our peak bone by age 18 in women, or the most bone we're going to get, 85 to 90% of our bone by age 18 in women and 20 in men. So this starts way back, but all through life, there are things we can do. And the things you do for your bones help the rest of your life as well. So it's not something separate.
Are there statistics on the rates of osteoporosis and osteopenia, from, let's say, 50 or 70 years ago compared to what they are now? And if so, what do those statistics look like?
That's an interesting question. They really don't have those because they didn't start all the evaluations that they do now. And they didn't have, here's the thing, they didn't have the medications, so people weren't really paying that much attention when they didn't have drugs to treat it. And unfortunately, in conventional medicine, it's sort of sad because you will get a diagnosis of osteoporosis and they'll say vitamin D. They do work on vitamin D, calcium, and they'll say exercise. They're not specific. But typically, if you have a certain number, and all that number means on the bone density, they look at your bone density compared to a 30-year-old and how many standard deviations away. So it's just really a number. It only talks about density, not quality. But anyway, they'll put you on, a medication without looking at root causes, without seeing what's really going on. So there's so many other things that can be done. That's the exciting part.
Okay, so I think what I was trying to get at with that question, and it's a shame we don't have good statistics, but I'm trying to understand the prevalence of this condition over the last few decades. Is there any good data that we have that can speak to that? Is this a condition that's been relatively constant throughout, the human species? Like, do we have evidence that this exists in hunter-gatherer peoples from the remains of archaeological digs, or from studying modern hunter-gatherers? Or is this something that is uniquely in modernized, westernized humans?
That's such a good question. And certainly when they look at cultures that are more hunter-gatherers, or different societies, they are at lower risk, or people who are active throughout life, and the hunter-gatherers would be that way. And that's very interesting in terms of, have they actually looked at their skeleton in detail and say that it's gotten worse? Or, it is more of an epidemic now, but people are also living a lot longer. So they're really seeing, older age. And so I do think it existed. It did exist, but when people were more active, when people, the diet was so different back, there wasn't all the processed foods. And I think the level of activity, as well as the nutrition, and people didn't have all the gut issues and all the root causes of osteoporosis. So they haven't really done those the longitudinal, those studies like that. But certainly in those cultures, there was less osteoporosis, and they have found that, those activities increase bone density, and there is a difference.
What are some of the key root causes, or maybe not some, but maybe take me through a good comprehensive list of the root causes of osteopenia and osteoporosis?
So it can start from childhood, and that's an interesting point, because when someone gets a number, is it that they're actively losing bone? Because inflammation is a root cause. So when there's anything that's causing inflammation in the body, whether it's dysbiosis with the gut, whether it's, autoimmune issues, it can also affect the bones, just like can affect different body parts. The bones can be affected. So any type of inflammatory process can be a root cause of osteoporosis. And so, however, it's important when people get diagnosed, are you actively losing bone, or were you a child that didn't exercise? You didn't have a good diet, or you had eating disorders, so it can be that you just never developed that much bone growing up. And so it's not that you're actively losing, it's just you don't have as much. So it will matter what it is. But in terms of, so anything with inflammation, anything with the gut, people who have issues, whether they're, any type of thing going on, Crohn's or, any of those issues, irritable bowel, all of those things where there's an inflammation, they may not be absorbing their nutrients. And the bones need nutrients. So if they're not getting the micronutrients, you could be losing, you're just not having the material for strong, healthy bones. So any type of gut issue like that. And they've even found gut bacteria. There's a correlation between bone density and the diversity of the microbiome. So they're finding such a relationship with the gut and the bone connection. So that's a big issue in terms of, again, so you either didn't build bone because you weren't active, you didn't have a good diet, or you had inflammation, or different medications. Steroids significantly reduce bone. And a lot of people, whether they're on inhalers or whether they're on...
You're talking about corticosteroids.
Yeah, corticosteroids.
As opposed to like what most people think of when they hear the word steroids, which is more like bodybuilding, anabolic, androgenic steroids.
Yeah, corticosteroids. A lot of people are on that, whether they're their inhalers or for different conditions. So that throughout life will certainly reduce bone density, as well as one of the biggest ones is the proton pump inhibitors. And so, and so many people have acid reflux and heartburn, and people are on this for a long period of time. And it's a huge risk factor because it reduces stomach acid. And we need that stomach acid to break down the proteins and the nutrients for the bone. So there's a big correlation with people who've been on proton pump inhibitors, any of those, the Nexium, the Prilosec, any of those that are reducing stomach acid and osteoporosis, as well as even, people aren't told, even if they are on medication such as antidepressants, which is so prevalent today, that can also, affect bone density and bone quality. And so medications, anti-seizure medication, thyroid, too much thyroid hormone, hyperthyroidism, that can cause, problems with osteoporosis. But so there's the gut inflammation. Then there's also inflammation if you have a sensitivity, let's say, to gluten. So celiac disease is known as a big risk factor for osteoporosis, but just gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity also. And I see this all the time where people go off gluten, and not only does their bone density improve, but then their arthritis improves and so many of the other conditions. So I'm trying to think what else I missed. And also hormones, for women, a lot of times they'll lose bone. I mean, that's common after menopause. That's where it accelerates bone loss. And so a lot of times if people are working with bioidenticals or different things, that can reduce, or prevent some of the bone loss, or just stress. Stress is the body's own cortisol. It increases your body's own inflammation. And so the cortisol has been shown to reduce the activity of the bone building cells. So how we react to stress is a very big issue. And I see this, all the time. So it's all the factors, it's multifactorial. You need to really look at everything. And just being a couch potato, the bones respond to the forces placed upon it. So people who are inactive, that puts them at much higher risk for osteoporosis.
You said in passing there, you gave the example of someone who didn't build a lot of bone density growing up as a child. Can you explain that more in depth? What would be the reasons for why they wouldn't build enough bone density?
Okay, so there's a couple. So activity is a big thing, and it scares me with our kids today who are, who many of them are just more sedentary, or they're working on the computer and they're just not getting out, because the way that bones build and get strong is through forces placed upon them. And what that is, in terms of jumping, forces through the bones against gravity. So being on the jungle gym, jumping and doing all those activities that we did, that kids do, and just playing is giving forces that say, hey, we need bone here. Because they've done studies showing, when people are on bed rest or they're not exercising, they lose bone. On bed rest, you can lose almost 1% of your bone per week. But for kids, there's a huge difference in activity levels. And they've shown, tennis players, their one arm has much higher bone density. Gymnasts have much higher bone density than other people. So we need that. We need those forces as we're growing, really, to develop normal bone. And that's what we want. So it's the one thing, the exercise and the activity. And unfortunately, there are kids who just don't do that. And then the second thing is the diet. You need the nutrients. We need calcium. We need magnesium. We need all from the rainbow. We need those bone building nutrients, as well as protein, good quality protein. And what blocks the absorption of many of those nutrients is sugar and the junk food. And so I think, depending on the diet, if you're not getting the nutrients, that's going to be, you're just not having the building blocks for good, healthy bones as you get older.
If you were going to say that there's one dominant factor in explaining the epidemic of bone density issues, what would you say is the single most important factor? Would it be nutrition, or would it be what you were just talking about, these forces acting on the bones?
I have to say it's both. I really can't say it's one versus the other, because you can improve bone density through doing both. I mean, exercise, I see this all, as a physical therapist, I've been working with this for over 25 years. And there are people that don't change anything. I mean, I'd like them to change everything and just increase their exercise, and they can improve their bone density. So I think, and you can certainly lose bone density if you're not exercising. So I have to say it's a combination. I think both can really be can be very negative, and both can have effects. And the key thing is you have to get to the underlying cause. But if you have inflammation from some process going on, let's just say gluten or celiac, you have to deal with that, because you can still be losing bone. And then, there's even other issues like parathyroid tumors that can happen. So you have to. But one thing I would say, I'm sorry, I can't say one if there was just one to do, and the same thing even with stress. So I just like to do the combination of everything, because you really need that for a good comprehensive program. You really need the mind, body, spirit, and the exercise, nutrition, as well as reducing stress.
Let's talk about nutrients. So nutrition and maybe some specific foods and specific nutrients that are uniquely beneficial for bone health, or you could also maybe speak to the opposite direction, uniquely harmful to bone health.
Okay. So the main thing really uniquely harmful, one of the things uniquely harmful is sugar. Sugar just reduces the absorption of magnesium, of calcium, and, it's just an anti-nutrient. So definitely, so you want to get rid of sugar. And for so many people, and I see, because I have people get tested, I see so many people with issues with inflammatory foods, but gluten. For some reason, I just see that when people have an issue with gluten, a lot of times it affects the inflammation, and they're not absorbing the nutrients, and they tend to have osteoporosis or osteopenia. So I see that as a very inflammatory food for many people. In terms of what's been very interesting in the research, and I don't think people know about this, something so important is protein, is getting enough protein. Because years ago they felt, these high protein diets or too much protein is going to cause calcium to be leached from the bone. But it's just the opposite. The research now shows we need enough protein, and we need more than the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, what they say. And so, they've done research on this, and the people that have increased in the studies bone density have had more, they have higher levels. And one formula, there's a couple you can use, but you can just take your body weight, divide by 0.5. That was one that they used in some of the research studies. So, but it's more than the RDA. And a lot of times people aren't getting the protein, especially as they get older. So just very important to make sure you get good quality. I'm big into organic, grass-fed, and wild. And, if it's a protein powder, have it organic. And, whether it's vegetarian or whether it's not. But the key is the quality and getting enough protein. That's found to be very, very important. Besides that, the one that everybody worries about and the big thing everybody is so concerned about is calcium. Problem I've found is that people are getting too much calcium because, their whole life they're like, drink milk, do this, do that. Plus, then the doctor says, oh, okay, take a calcium supplement. Well, more is not better. And so in the United States, they recommend anyone over 50 gets 1,200 milligrams. In other countries, it's less. But and so what happens is people are getting some in their diet. They're taking more, let's say they take 1,200 milligrams as a supplement. They're getting too much. And there have been some research, not conclusive, but showing that this extra calcium isn't good. It goes places we don't want, as the arteries or kidney stones.
With that in mind, let's talk about how we might address root causes. So let's go into what are the root causes for this. I'm curious. I mean, you're obviously a very atypical case having this at 30 years old. So I'm curious what your root causes were and if they are the same or different from the more common root causes of that middle-aged and older women are especially susceptible to.
Yeah, no, that's great. So for me, I'll just start with me as an example. Yes, I am an atypical situation. Most of the time, unless somebody has celiac disease or other GI conditions from a young age, which those can be contributors. If somebody from a young age, 90% of your bone mass is put on by the time you turn age 18, and the remaining 10% is put on by the time you turn 30. So if you had, at a younger age, you smoked or drank excessively, you led a sedentary lifestyle, you took certain medications, you had an eating disorder, you didn't get proper diet and nutrition from a young age, all of those things can contribute to you not achieving and reaching peak bone mass. So that can be part of the picture too. But for me, I had some of those things. When I was in the Marine Corps, I partied a little bit hard. I smoked cigarettes for 5 years. Not good decisions. Actually, if there's one thing I regret, it was smoking cigarettes. I would never do that again.
Yeah.
But then I also had digestive issues, and I was staying up late, and I wasn't getting proper sleep, and was stressed out all the time. And having celiac disease was probably the primary contributor for me. Mm-hmm. Because when you resolve that, you can actually have an improvement and be able to digest your food and absorb your nutrients. Now, for most people, a lot of people don't know this, but there's multiple types of osteoporosis. So you've got primary osteoporosis. That's related typically to a decrease in estrogen in postmenopausal women, right? Estrogen has a protective effect on bone. When estrogen levels decrease, as they do during menopause, that's going to cause an increase in the activity level cells that break down bone. But then there's a whole nother cause, and that's what I fell into, which was secondary osteoporosis. And that's where this occurs as a result of behaviors, conditions, disorders, diseases, and medications. And most people unexpectedly diagnosed, 30s, 40s, 50s, they have or had a secondary cause. But just because you're a postmenopausal woman does not mean we should just say, oh, it's just hormones, it's a natural part of aging, and move on with the medication and not address root cause issues. Because I've seen many, many times where there are still root cause issues that have to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what about what's going on? Like, is there a trend in prevalence of this in terms of the last 30, 50 years? And if there is, what are the biggest explanatory factors for that?
Yeah, I would definitely say this is not something that's going down. It's increasing. We've got more cases of osteopenia, osteoporosis, fractures. That's on the rise. Obviously, hormones play a massive role. And if people are not taking the steps they need, especially before or right around menopause, including even considering bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, then you could potentially have an issue there. And then also, when it comes to the other contributing factors to bone loss and osteoporosis, if you have those things and you're not addressing them, then that's going to be something that you need to do. And I could just even walk through some of the more common things that can be contributing to bone loss and osteoporosis, which,
yeah, please let's talk about some of these key root causes.
yeah. So one of the first ones would be medications, right? So if you've got glucocorticoid medications, a lot of people take these medications. They're steroid medications designed to suppress inflammation. They mimic natural steroid hormones in the body. They're going to be used to treat conditions like asthma, like autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis. Two of the more common drug names a lot of people will probably know are prednisone and cortisone. Bone loss is a common side effect of those medications, and that happens for a few reasons. The first one is that those medications, they're going to reduce the GI absorption of calcium. They're going to increase urinary excretion of calcium. That causes a deficit. And then we have the glucocorticoids are directly acting on osteoclasts, the bone breakdown cells, to increase their lifespan. And what happens there is that ends up reducing your bone density. Also, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, typically used as antidepressants. There was a review of 19 studies on the effect of SSRIs that indicate they have a negative effect on bone mineral density and increase the risk of fracture.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's super, super important. And then this is a big one, right? Antacids. These are drugs that reduce the production of or increase the suppression of stomach acid. So these are your proton pump inhibitors, your H2 receptor antagonist drugs. That would be omeprazole, Nexium, Prevacid, ranitidine, Zantac. Tums can even fall into this category, right? A lot of people that have or think they have too much stomach acid actually have too little stomach acid. And when they take these, they end up suppressing what little stomach acid they do have. And the reason that's a problem is because you need stomach acid to properly break down and extract nutrients from your food, like amino acids. The building blocks of protein. Your bones are 50% protein by volume. They need amino acids, calcium, magnesium, iron, B12. If you've got low stomach acid, you're going to be starving of those nutrients basically. So that's going to obviously increase, issues with having enough calcium. It's going to increase your risk of osteoporosis. So those are some of the bigger ones. And then digestive issues. Those are, I mentioned celiac disease. That's an autoimmune condition where the consumption of gluten damages these tiny little nutrient absorption centers in your small intestine called villi. These are responsible for absorbing the nutrients from the food you eat. But when you eat gluten and you have celiac disease, that's going to blunt those villi to the point where they can't actually do their job. And when they can't do their job, they're not going to be absorbing your calcium, your vitamin D, your phosphorus. And your bones, your body still needs those nutrients on a daily basis to execute its daily functions. And if you're not taking them in and you're not absorbing them, where's it going to go? It's going to go to the bones, your greatest mineral reserves, and it's going to pull those. And that's going to be contributor to bone loss and osteoporosis. So those are some of the big ones. I mean, there are many, many contributors, but those are a couple of the really big ones.
Okay. A few more specific questions. Are you aware of any significant environmental toxicants that are linked with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest ones that we're facing, I wouldn't even say, I could go to environmental in just a sec, but I would say one of the biggest ones is that people are consuming on a daily basis in many cases is sugar. If people didn't know that sugar was an issue before, I'm going to give you one more reason as to why it's probably not a good thing for your bone health. Number one is sugar damages bone by triggering an inflammatory response. So it's going to lower your vitamin D levels. It's going to deplete your bone healthy minerals like calcium, magnesium, chromium, and copper. It's going to inhibit that intestinal absorption of calcium, and it's going to block the absorption of vitamin C. And vitamin C is key for maintaining a healthy skeleton. So I mean, most of your audience is probably already aware that if you're eating crackers and cookies and cakes and pizzas, pastas and crackers and all that stuff, that's not going to be the best thing to support, your bone health. So that's probably one of the main things. And then also chemicals, glyphosate is a big one, right? It's a broad spectrum systemic herbicide, crop desiccant. It's sprayed on and around certain foods. That's associated with an increased risk of cancer, but it's also a chelator of minerals too. Right. So you need those minerals and those nutrients. You need to be able to take those in and absorb those nutrients. So that's another big one. But then also unfiltered water, right? If you're drinking unfiltered tap water, there's a good chance you're consuming all those chemicals and pollutants that the Environmental Working Group talks about and says are found in our water, those volatile organic compounds, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, chlorine, fluoride. There's actually, you can go to ewg.org/tap water. You type in your zip code, and it's going to generate a list of all these contaminants that are detected in your tap water that exceed health guidelines. So you can go find that information out now. And then what you do to remedy that is you can go invest in a filtration system or something like that, reverse osmosis with remineralizer, or you could find something like a solid block carbon filter, like a Berkey or something with fluoride filters. That's going to filter out the bad stuff, but it's going to leave in the minerals. So those are some big ones that I would say too. And then we've got BPA and phthalates, in plastics and water bottles, plastic food containers, synthetic fragrances, commercial cleaning products. So these are all things that a lot of us have, and we can always find healthier or better alternatives to these things. Switch to the essential oils. You can clean with vinegar or Castile soap. A lot of different things you could swap out there.